Please welcome Rachael Everard, Head of Sustainability, Rolls-Royce. Val Miftakhov, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, ZeroAvia. Rachael Muncrief, Deputy Director, the International Council on Clean Transportation. Willie Walsh, Director General, the International Air Transport Association. And Bloomberg's John Fraher.
Thank you, everyone. So from AI to the future of aviation. Well, the future of aviation has never looked more exciting. It seems like every time you look at we read the news, we read about new exciting technologies that are going to take us where we want to go faster and cleaner than ever. Hydrogen, electric planes, air taxis, sustainable aviation fuel. But at the same time, there's a dark shadow looming over all of this. Aviation accounts for 2.5% of global emissions, and whether we like it or not, we're all part of that problem. Aviation is sort of hardwired into the global economy. So solving this is obviously one of the most crucial challenges facing the world and facing the industry. We're on the way to doing it for ground transport, for EVs, but how do we do that for planes? Exciting technologies exist, but as a recent report said, the cost of decarbonising the aviation industry could be as high as 820 billion euros. So there's a lot to do, a lot to get into. Willie, let me start with you. Well, firstly, your old sparring partner, Michael O'Leary, had the audience in stitches earlier. Do you have any good jokes?
Well, Michael and I get on very well, but we shared a panel once when we were asked to explain why there were so many Irish people involved in aviation. And of course, I gave the very diplomatic response about the history of aircraft leasing and how that really has led to people being involved. And he turned around, he said, no. He said, hang on a second. He said, it's very simple. He said, airlines are full of liars, bullshitters, and drunks. And he said, in Ireland, we excel at all three.
Well, let's run with that in this panel, shall we?
I won't tell you which one I am and which one he is.
But before we get into that and all of these technologies and the question of decarbonisation, I mean, obviously you're an industry veteran. Can you just give us like a very, very, very quick sort of your view on where the aviation industry is now coming out of the pandemic?
Yeah, we're doing well at the moment. The recovery is strong and is continuing. I think there are some positives there. The reopening of China came as a surprise. We weren't expecting that to happen until later on this year. If I look at it in February, we're at about globally 85% of where we were in 2019. Domestic markets have effectively fully recovered. Some are above where they were in 2019, some slightly below. International aviation is at about 78% of where it was in 2019. But that will recover now with the opening of China and the relaxation of restrictions in Asia. And if I look at it, international travel within Asia last year was at 22% of where it was in 2019. So there's still a long way to go to fully recover. But the airline industry globally is expected to make a small profit this year, very small, just under 5 billion collectively, predominantly because of the strong performance in the US, and that's really the US domestic market. But we are going in the right direction.
Good. Thank you for that. So let's get into it. Let's get into decarbonisation. Can you sort of lay the table, I guess, for this conversation? What is the best case scenario for how we decarbonise aviation over the next 30 years? Planes are heavy. They need a lot of energy and power to get off the ground. I think there's a forecast that the number of passengers in the world is going to more than double between now and 2040.
Yeah, but I think there's a big disconnect between the number of passengers and the CO2 from the industry, and that's been going on for some time. Like, if I look back to between 2000 and 2019, so ignoring the period of the crisis, so between 2000 and 2019, passenger numbers were 2.7 times. CO2 was 1.5. So we have seen a disconnect between passenger growth and CO2 growth. Now, that's not to say CO2 won't continue to grow at a gross level. It will. The positive, however, is that the industry is absolutely determined to achieve net zero in 2050. We had previously set a target of a 50% reduction in net emissions by 2050, but we recognise that we were now out of line with the science and out of line with the government and political thinking. So at our AGM 2 years ago, we committed to net zero in 2050, and we put forward a pathway to achieving that. Now, I say A because we recognize that there will be multiple options and things will develop over time. But the predominant contribution will come from sustainable aviation fuel, which, based on the pathway that we identified, would account for about 65% of the abatement in 2050. Technology will contribute. We will, at that stage, based on what we're currently seeing, still have a requirement for some offsetting, but most of it will come through the form of sustainable aviation fuel. And some of the offsetting, by the way, will be, we define carbon capture as offsetting. So it's not the offsetting as we've known it historically. So we believe we can get there. It is going to be expensive, you're quite right. We're continuing to estimate the cost of various different options, but it will likely be in excess of $1 trillion US dollars. And that will have to be borne by consumers. There's just no way around that. If I look at the industry, the best 10 years in our history, 2010 to 2019, the industry made an operating profit or an operating margin of 5.4%. And that was with fuel. Brent was at $80 a barrel, jet was at $93.60 a barrel. So fuel represented 27% of the cost base. Today, sustainable aviation fuel is more than twice the price of traditional kerosene. So there is no way this industry, given the tiny margins that we operate with, can absorb the additional cost that's coming down the track. So ultimately, you will see higher energy prices reflected in higher ticket prices, which clearly will have an impact on demand going forward.
Do you have a best guess on how much an average plane ticket, let's say London to New York, would cost in like 10 years, 20 years time?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say at this stage. The one thing I would say is that our industry has been able to cope with price volatility in oil. Back in 2008, oil prices in June, July 2008 were $150 a barrel. In January 2009, they were $40 a barrel. So that volatility is something the industry can cope with. What we see, though, is that going forward, sustainable fuels, or whatever way you look at it, e-fuels, will be more expensive than traditional kerosene, which will increase the cost base, and the cost base will have to be reflected in higher ticket prices. But difficult at this stage to quantify that in terms of the impact on average ticket prices.
I'll get back to you later on sustainable aviation fuel and whether there's enough land on the planet to actually make all of that fuel. But we'll get back to that in a moment. I want to bring in Rachael here. Your organization, you look very closely at government policy around the world. And again, making the parallel with electric vehicles, one of the big reasons why we're seeing this huge shift towards electric cars is because of government intervention. It is because of the rules and laws about phasing out the internal combustion engine over the next 20, 30 years. Can you sort of give us sort of a global overview on where you see global aviation policy right now in terms of encouraging, pushing, forcing the aviation industry to make these changes?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. And just to give you just a little bit of background, I work for a nonprofit, and as a lot of nonprofits, we are mission-driven, and our mission is really to reduce the carbon emissions from global transportation in line with what is required by the Paris commitments. And I always, I'm at these talking about climate change all the time. It can get a little depressing. So I always want to start off with a little bit of a positive. We know how to do it. It's ambitious, but it is feasible, and we can already see it happening, like you mentioned, in the on-road sector. The targets that the EU just recently finalized in terms of not allowing the sale of internal combustion engines for cars after 2035. The new proposal, actually, the UK just put out is even a little bit stronger than that, which is nice. US is having a complementary proposal. Those are actually kind of in line with what we need to stay below 2 degrees. Last year, we did a study on aviation, and we also looked at how we can keep the aviation sector below 2 degrees. And Willie mentioned a lot of the same findings that we had. It's going to be a lot about sustainable aviation fuel. It's going to be about improved efficiencies, and it's going to be about zero emission planes, which I think we're going to hear a little bit more about shortly. And the exciting part for us is that we have identified a pathway that is feasible. Now we are going to need government regulations, and I think it's kind of interesting. You look at what's taking place in Europe, and you look at what's taking place in the US, and they're kind of going on two different pathways. Let's start with the US. We've heard a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act is really about incentives and subsidies to bring the sustainable aviation fuel using government money, and that's going to probably get us displacing about 10% of our aviation fuel by about 2030, something along those lines. That is using government money. The EU is taking a different approach. They're actually putting in place a proposal to put in place blending mandates. So that means the airlines themselves the fuel suppliers and the airlines themselves are responsible for using ever increasing amounts of sustainable aviation fuels. I think both types of policies are great examples. I would say the mandates are really the thing that is going to make the this kind of polluter pay principle. We don't all fly with governments doing massive subsidies. Those are great. When you have mandates, they're being taken up by the people who are actually flying. We talked about ticket prices. We have an estimate on average 22% increase in a ticket price, something along the lines by 2050.
By what? By 2050?
Yeah. So, we believe strongly that, government has a strong role to play here. The other thing is I've talked about US, I've talked about Europe. China and India is where the massive growth is happening in the aviation sector. They're still working on their plans. They don't quite have the pathway that they've identified yet. So we'll be looking to support them on that.
Okay. Well, we've talked about how depressing climate can be, but we like at Bloomberg Green, we like to write a lot about the exciting technologies that are going to decarbonize our economy. Valerie, I'd like to talk to you. You're the CEO of ZeroAvia, which is all about hydrogen electric propulsion. Before I ask you the skeptical question about hydrogen and get into it, do you want to tell the audience just a little bit about what your technology does and what your company does?
Sure. So I'm founder, CEO of ZeroAvia. We're about 5.5 years old. We built new generation of engines for future of aviation, all sizes of aircraft eventually. We're flying already several prototypes out of about 200 miles from here in the Cotswolds. We have our flight test base in the UK, and we're flying now 20-seat aircraft with our fuel cell engines. So there's a full-size commercial aircraft, small, but commercial use, and full-size engine. We're looking to deploy this in market in 2025, so 2.5 years out. Already working with the certification agencies across the world, CAA, FAA, EASA. On your earlier point about the sort of depressing dark shadow, actually, the situation is both worse and better than you described. The carbon emissions alone is 2.7%, but for aviation, majority of the impact is actually not in carbon. Majority of the impact is from the non-carbon artifacts of combustion. And while the error bars on those estimates are still large, we just had the session at Jet Zero Council over in Farnborough just 2 days ago, I think, or maybe yesterday. Time's a little bit. The situation is that if you continue combust fuel at high altitudes, you're still going to have all of those non-CO2 effects. And then if you take a metric of, for example, dollars spent per climate abatement, anything combustion related, especially more expensive combustion related technologies, are not going to make it with respect to non-combustion technologies. And that was the thinking when we started thinking about the technology basis for ZeroAvia and going after larger commercial aircraft. It was clear to us that we have to get away from combustion, which means that we have to electrify this transport. But the batteries would just not have enough energy, not enough energy in the weight allowance that you have in the aircraft. So we need to get electricity from something better. And that better substance is hydrogen. It's actually 3 times better on the energy content per unit of weight than even kerosene, even the jet fuel. And then the fuel cells convert that energy into electricity much more efficiently, or energy into propulsion much more efficiently than any combustion engine. So you have fuel that's better objectively, and you're converting it to propulsion more efficiently, and you're avoiding all the climate effects, right? Combustion, non-combustion system avoids all the non-carbon effects. So you obviously avoid all carbon if the hydrogen comes from zero-emission sources. So all of that means that you have hydrogen electric as fundamentally, from first principles, the best solution. And it's only a matter of time until we have that transition. While we have that transition to all sides of the vehicles over the next 20, 30 years, SAF, whether synthetic or bio, is a transition fuel. That's our opinion. The transition fuel that powers the aircraft of larger sizes throughout that transition. So it's a multi-decade opportunity there, but eventually it will go just like the whole automotive market is moving towards electric cars now, will move towards zero-emission propulsion.
But so much of the emissions from the airline industry come from long-haul flight. Right, this is not going to be a solution for that.
Why not?
Right.
Why not? It can be. So again, in aviation, what matters the most is weight. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, by the way, why we think that for batteries it will be very, very hard situation to power any significant size aircraft, because you get into this sort of rocket equation type problem, right? When you need more battery to carry battery, right? And you kind of exponentially run out of room. So the main problem in aviation is weight, and by weight, hydrogen is, again, 3 times better energy content than jet fuel. Once you take into account the higher efficiency of the hydrogen electric propulsion, fuel cells, electric motors, you're actually 4 to 5 times better on the per unit of weight than jet fuel. So even with the extra weights that you have to put in the fuel storage system, you're still significantly better than jet fuel. So on mass, you're better. You need more volume to store the fuel to go transatlantic or trans-Pacific, but the volume is much less of a problem for aircraft designed for aviation than weight. So, Airbus has announced part of their ZeroAvia program. They announced the wing body design that they want to bring to market. That design has 3 to 4 times more space for fuel than traditional sort of wing and tube design. So that's the type of designs that we're going to see. And on the time order of this 2-3 decades, this is entirely possible. So what I see happening a lot in these discussions is that classic example of people underestimate what can happen in 20, 30 years, right, decades, and overestimate what can happen in a year, right? And as a result, we're myopic to these major transitions that are powered by these first principles, physics, chemistry, fundamentals, right? And the same thing happened in automotive, just on batteries, right? And yes, the initial introduction was fueled by the government mandates and government subsidies, but now for a lot of commercial applications, electric cars are actually better economically than combustion cars. It's just operating costs and amortized acquisition costs are better for taxis and for a lot of other applications. Same thing's going to happen here.
I'm going to bring in Rachael in a moment, but Willie, how plausible does that sound to you?
I think the issue we have is looking at 2050 as the absolute deadline of achieving net zero. And while I fully accept what is being said, today 75 to 80% of CO2 produced by the industry is from flights of greater than 1,500 kilometers. So I fully accept that beyond probably 2040 and certainly beyond 2050, hydrogen becomes much more of a factor. But what we've been looking at is how do we get to net zero in 2050, because that's the critical deadline. As it is today, it'll probably change. That 2050 may even be brought forward, and we know that there are some countries who have greater ambition than that. So it will require for us to fully exploit technology like hydrogen. It will require new aircraft design. The advantage of sustainable aviation fuel is because it's what we call a drop-in fuel. It can be used on the aircraft that are in service today and the aircraft that will be delivered over the next 10 years, which will continue to be in service probably out to 2050. And it also uses the existing infrastructure at airports. So, it's definitely one of the ways that we will use to reduce to net zero. But clearly for us, out to 2050, sustainable aviation fuel is the most important.
And a best guess for you when we would see a commercially viable hydrogen plane?
Well, Airbus are talking about 2035 for the introduction. So if you assume it's introduced in 2035, and they seem to be pretty confident around that, but for that to have any real impact, it will be beyond 2050.
Right. Rachael, Everard, I want to bring you in. You're Chief Sustainability Officer at Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce, of course, are on the front end of all of this. Do you want to give us sort of an overview of like where the sort of the most interesting and exciting developments are in terms of taking the jet engine that we have now and making it cleaner, and also developing different kinds of engines?
Yeah, thank you. And I think actually agree absolutely with a lot of what's been said across the panel. So Rolls-Royce, when we look at our net zero transition strategy, I really think about it as having kind of 4 pillars. And when we spoke earlier, I mentioned 3, but I'm going to add a 4th. So firstly is making the most efficient engines that we have today even more efficient. So what you travel on transatlantic, how we can squeeze out every single drop of improved fuel burn, therefore improved efficiency, maximize that potential. Slightly higher kind of fans, more air coming through the engine, squeezing it up, really being able to generate maximum thrust. And I think what's really great about that is you don't have to change the infrastructure. What we have today, all the embedded carbon that's within our aviation infrastructure remains, it has a role to play. Then the drop-in fuels, the SAFs, the sustainable aviation fuels, whether they're from kind of bio or waste generated or whether they're ultimately e-fuels synthetically produced, those are available today. They can be used on our engines that are in service today without any need to change anything, which I think is a fantastic interim solution, delivering up to around a 70 to 80% life cycle CO2 saving, so pretty substantial. Today, regulation only allows us to use about a 50-50% blend. We've proven across our portfolio that our engines are ready to go on 100% with no changes. And then thirdly, the kind of exciting end of the market, the disruptive technologies, fully electric, hydrogen. I think those all have a role to play, and it's depends kind of how far you want to go, how many people you're trying to move, or how many goods you're trying to move. And all of those different solutions all play a role just depending on how you scale up or down that curve. And then my 4th pillar that I didn't mention earlier, but I think it's around that enabling environment. What's the landscape that the aviation industry needs in order to be successful? So whether it's the policies that we've talked about, it's also around people's acceptance of these technologies. You mentioned some of the kind of triangle-shaped wide wing planes. People also have to choose whether or not they will get on them. And I think that's a really important point that we can't underestimate as well, is how we collectively as an entire system have to adapt. Because that's the thing with aviation. We talked about kind of re-globalization, I think, right this morning. We are such a global industry, and you are always taking off in one location, almost always taking off in one location and landing in another. So you need to have that infrastructure on the ground ready to go. So you can either refuel your plane, your hydrogen fuel cell, you can recharge your battery, or you can put in your SAF, and that has to happen kind of unanimously across the sector. We can't have kind of isolated technologies coming to fruition at different timescales, and I think that's what's very kind of unique sometimes about aviation. But from Rolls-Royce's perspective, yeah, we've got a number of really exciting technology projects. We broke the world speed record last year with an all-electric plane, single-seater, but it's the world's most powerful battery ever taken to the sky, so really proving the potential of some of that technology. We are working on some hydrogen projects as well, which I won't go into in too much detail, but again, we've tested a gaseous hydrogen engine actually. Again, operated as expected, no real changes needed, which is pretty key in an industry that's so heavily regulated and relies so much on certification. No changes, sometimes a really, really good thing. And then we're doing, as I said, a huge amount on SAF and on our new engine technologies, a program we called UltraFan, which is bringing about whole new levels of kind of composite materials in our engines, really big new fan blades, really increasing that bypass ratio, really maximizing what we know today.
I mean, we've heard a lot about SAF already on this panel, and I'd like to dig into that a little more. I mean, Rachael Muncrief, I mean, what do you say to this again, the question I sort of alluded to earlier, like there just is there enough acreage and land on the planet to actually make all of the sustainable aviation fuel?
Yeah,
I mean, if it's going to be, I think 65%, Willie, was the number that you guys are looking at.
Yeah, and I mean,
how are we going to make all of that?
Just to clarify, there's sort of, and we've sort of brought it up a couple of times, but just to make sure everyone's clear, there's sort of 2 different buckets of sustainable aviation fuels. There's the kind made from biomass, and then there's the kind made from renewable energy, right? And so right now, all of the SAFs that are available are the kind made from biomass. So over time, you're going to see that transition, and we're going to move towards the kind made from renewable energy. I don't think we do have a limit on biomass, especially the really low carbon biomass. Not all biomass is created equal. So if you are using something that's a food-based biomass, that's not really good for the environment, to be honest. We need, the more like sort of the second generation biomass and that sort of thing. And then over time, once we have a lot more green electrons, other sectors working in parallel to get those, we're going to be able to switch towards these sort of the e-kerosene and this kind of thing made from renewable electricity. And I will just also add a plug in, because these kind of sustainable fuels are so much needed in the aviation sector. We cannot use them in the on-road sector. We just don't have there's not enough of them. And these sectors are fighting for, there's a very limited quantity of fuels. We already have solutions in the on-road sector. And so this is one of the reasons that my organization, every time we hear about, fuel-based like e-fuel or biofuel solutions for the on-road sector, we're like, no. We need to be putting those into aviation where they're more needed.
That's right. For the uninitiated in the audience, can you explain very e-kerosene? What exactly? How is that made? Where does that come from?
Yeah, you basically take carbon dioxide out of the air, and you use electricity and you convert it into essentially a drop-in fuel that's basically the equivalent of kerosene. If you looked at it, you wouldn't know. And then when you burn it, over the whole life cycle, it's a carbon neutral fuel.
Yeah.
And today, the e-fuels, which are technically possible but very expensive, and the critical issue is you have to get renewable energy, because you're using, electrolysis break down water to produce hydrogen to combine it with CO2. So, the raw materials are available, but the energy required is very high today, and therefore it's also very expensive. But the projected price for e-fuels, your organization did a great paper on this. If you go out to 2050, I think it projected average prices for a gallon of e-fuel at just over $4 a gallon. Average of a gallon of kerosene first 3 months of this year was about $2.80. So you can see it's more expensive. But not way more expensive, that it's beyond the capability of the industry to address this. So there definitely are solutions there. What we need to see from an airline point of view, and this goes very much to what Rachael said earlier, was the difference in approach between the US, which is very much the carrot, incentivizing production, and in the EU, the stick. Now, I don't believe that we need to show any demand signals, because the industry has said we are going to hit net zero in 2050, and we're going to do that largely through sustainable fuels. So we want to see greater production. The US is definitely going to incentivize production through the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides at a federal level up to $1.75 per gallon if it can be at 100% reduction, $1.25 at 50% reduction. So there's definitely going to be quite a lot of investment in the US. So I've absolutely no doubt that the US will achieve its goals in terms of sustainable aviation fuel. I'm more concerned about Europe, where today, we're being forced to blend fuel. If you look at France, for example, they've mandated a 2% blend.
By the 2024?
Well, they're saying today.
So, yeah.
And it isn't there.
Yeah.
And if it isn't there, you pay a fine. But incentivizing somebody to produce something is very different to forcing somebody to buy something that isn't there. Yeah. So I think getting the right policy frameworks in place is important. And I'm not saying they have to be exactly the same, but I think there is scope for a greater push within Europe and the UK to incentivize the production of sustainable aviation fuels.
Valerie wants to get in, but very quick follow-up. We've touched very briefly earlier on India and China. India and China is a huge part of the future of aviation, obviously. Are you seeing, how would you rate the attempts by those airlines in those countries to get to net zero?
Yeah, everybody wants to get to net zero in 2050. I think some are more confident about how they can get there because they've already modeled the cost impact and they see it, within their ability to get there. Others are much more concerned.
Yeah.
But at an industry level, I'm very confident that we will achieve it.
Valerie, sorry.
Yeah, just a quick point. One thing that gets lost sometimes in these discussions is that, as Rachael mentioned, right, the scalable part of the SAF is really synthetic, right? Synthetic production from hydrogen and carbon capture and all that, right? So in some ways, the only way we're going to move aviation to zero climate impact, zero emission is through hydrogen, right? Because you need hydrogen for synthetic SAF production. You need hydrogen for what we do. You need hydrogen for what Rolls-Royce does with the combustion, okay? And that's the only way you're going to get enough zero emission energy, renewable energy, on board the aircraft. There is no other way. Not going to happen, okay? So when we talk to people in the hydrogen space, right, so like hydrogen councils of the world and all that, we present this opportunity, and it's really an opportunity for a hydrogen industry to have this protected space where, as already mentioned, there are other sectors where some other solutions will work, right? So batteries for trucks, batteries for cars, but for aviation, all roads take us to hydrogen, right? And that's an important bit to think about, and specifically green hydrogen, right? So the electrolysis capacity needs to grow up, and all of these technologies around that as well. So just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, I came into this panel hoping to sort of bring some skepticism to the hydrogen story, but clearly I'm failing.
I think there has to be skepticism, though, because there is no hydrogen infrastructure today.
Right.
And that is part of the challenge,
Yes.
right? And as you say, everyone is talking about hydrogen as this silver bullet solution, and it largely is, but there isn't enough green hydrogen in the world. Everyone is wanting green hydrogen. So there has to be this massive scale-up of availability of green hydrogen, as well as fuels like SAFs, as a shorter-term solution. I think that's part of this skepticism has to exist.
And from where you said, I mean, I have a whole panel on this tomorrow, so people can come and listen to that as well. But if you look at the policy, I mean, Willie was talking about the policy incentives from the EU versus the US in terms of the hydrogen that we need. Are you more encouraged by what we're hearing from Brussels or what we're hearing from Washington, or neither of them?
I think, as we said, it's carrot and stick, right? Two different approaches. I think we're relatively agnostic as long as we continue to get the investment we need into R&D. Aviation is a very important but also very expensive industry to decarbonize. So the more that we can support those R&D programs, the better.
Yeah. So just a sort of final question, really, and Willie, I'll start with you, but very keen to sort of hear what everyone else has to say. I mean, from what we're hearing here, this is going to be incredibly expensive. Mm-hmm. The airline industry, as we were saying before we came on stage, margins in the airline industry are wafer thin. It's going to be much more expensive for people to travel. And then you combine that with the political climate at the moment. You look at the US, the attack on ESG, the attack on woke capitalism. Are customers actually going to pay?
Yeah, I believe they will. We're seeing continued strong demand. I think the one thing I would address, though, if you look at some initiatives like France with this technical ban on short-haul flying, which of course isn't a ban on short-haul flying, it impacts on 3 domestic routes from Orly. You can still fly on the routes that are impacted from Charles de Gaulle, but you can't fly from Orly. But here is where data is very important. Eurocontrol did an excellent study. If you banned all flights in Europe, every single one below 500 kilometers, you would reduce the number of flights by 24%, but the impact on CO2 is only 3.8%. So I think when we're making these decisions, we need to understand, what is the impact of the decision going to be? And we need to be honest with people. If you banned all short-haul flying in Europe, say 3.8%. If you introduce the single European sky in Europe, which is technically possible today, you would reduce emissions by 10%. So there are steps that we can take, and we need every single possible contribution to get to net zero in 2050. But I'm very clear that from an industry point of view, we can do it, and you will be able to continue to fly between now and 2050. And in 2050, this industry will be at net zero. And beyond 2050, I think we can look then at moving towards gross, zero. But still a long way to go to get to that.
Rachael, did you want to get in on that?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I'll just say, one of the things we also are very focused on is equity. And when you look at aviation in terms of a transportation mode, it's probably one of the most inequitable. A very small number of folks creating the bulk of the emissions. And even when you look within the folks that are flying, there's an even smaller number that are either like the business flyers, like probably most of us here, and the frequent flyers. So when you take those costs, do you want to just spread them out evenly across everyone, or the people that are like really the ones causing the emissions? How can we see about getting them to maybe pay a little bit more? These are kind of things that we'll start looking into. Also, how do you give better information to the people that are flying? A lot of people, if they see there's 2 flights and one of them is actually going to be a lot more less carbon intensive than the other, they might select that flight. So we need to put more also information into the hands of consumers as well.
And just to put some data on that, premium flying, so people who fly in business and first class, 8% of the total flying that's done.
Practically out of time, I've got one very, very quick quick-fire question for everyone on the panel. In 20 years' time, so a lot of people flew in here from New York. I'm going to pick New York to Dublin as a case study for this. In 20 years' time, will the energy, the fuel that powers a New York to Dublin flight be electric, hydrogen, SAF, or standard current kerosene aviation?
SAF, predominantly.
I'm going to have to go with SAF.
Hydrogen.
Of course.
I think you have a combination. You have a battery and SAF. Oh, hydrogen.
But thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to the panel. Thank you for coming. We're out of time. Thank you.